Ancient Egypt, early in the morning, as the sun rises slowly over the eastern horizon, illuminating the Nile and the vast fields that depend on its rhythm, appears calm, almost serene. The light moves gradually across stone and water, revealing a civilization that has learned to present itself as eternal. Nothing here feels hurried. Nothing feels uncertain. Egypt wakes each day with the confidence of a world that believes it has already solved the problem of existence. Life proceeds according to a structure that has endured for generations, and this endurance itself is offered as proof that the order of things is correct. For those who live within this system, time is not experienced as open or expectant, but as repetitive and regulated. Work begins not because the body is ready, but because the system requires it. Schedules govern movement, and movement governs survival. The day unfolds exactly as it did yesterday and as it will tomorrow, creating a sense that history is no longer moving forward, but circling endlessly around the same demands. In such a world, change feels not only unlikely, but almost unthinkable. Egypt's power does not reside solely in its armies or its rulers, but in its ability to shape perception. Monumental architecture dominates the landscape, not merely as a display of strength, but as a constant reminder that this civilization intends to outlast memory itself. These structures communicate a quiet but persistent message. This world is stable, this order is permanent, and nothing beyond it is necessary. Pharaoh does not need to speak often, because the stones speak for him. The system enforces itself through repetition, through scale, through the slow normalization of inequality. Within this carefully maintained order, suffering is not treated as an emergency. It is absorbed into routine. Those who labor under the sun learn early that pain is not a signal for intervention, but an expected cost of stability. Their lives are measured in output rather than dignity, and over time even the desire for something different begins to fade. Imagination narrows, hope becomes inefficient. The future collapses into a continuation of the present, and survival replaces expectation. Children are born into this world already shaped by its assumptions. They grow up learning which questions lead nowhere and which thoughts are safest left unexplored. The structure of life teaches them, long before words do, that reality has boundaries and that those boundaries are fixed. In this way, Egypt achieves its greatest victory. It convinces people that what exists is all that could ever exist. Freedom becomes a concept without reference, and longing slowly learns to be silent. Yet beneath this appearance of permanence, something begins to shift. It does not arrive dramatically, and it does not announce itself as resistance. It begins quietly, almost imperceptibly, as exhaustion accumulates and suffering refuses to disappear. A sound emerges, first as a groan, then as a cry, carrying no strategy and no vision of liberation, only the raw truth that life is not as it should be. At first, this cry changes nothing. The sun continues to rise, the work continues, and the system remains intact. But the cry persists, moving through time and memory, growing heavier not because it becomes louder, but because it does not go away. And somewhere beyond the imagination of empire, beyond the reach of Pharaoh's carefully constructed world, that cry is heard. Far from the monuments of Egypt, far from the rigid schedules and the endless repetition of labor, another life unfolds quietly in a land that does not pretend to be eternal. The wilderness does not offer the illusion of permanence. It shifts with the wind, changes with the seasons, and resists every attempt to fully control it. This is where Moses now lives, long after his name faded from the memory of the palace, long after his brief moment of intervention ended not in liberation, but in failure and flight. His days are simple, marked not by ambition, but by routine. He tends flocks, follows familiar paths, and lives at a distance from the world that once claimed him. Moses carries within himself a divided history. He was shaped by Egypt, educated in its wisdom, familiar with its power, yet never fully at home within it. He knew the language of empire, but he also knew, perhaps more deeply than most, its violence. His earlier attempt to confront injustice did not produce freedom, it produced exile. Whatever confidence he once possessed has been worn down by time and disappointment. By the moment this story finds him again, Moses is no longer imagining change. He has settled into survival, into the quiet resignation that often follows unfulfilled hope. It is here, in this ordinary and unremarkable setting, that interruption occurs. Not in a palace, not in a place of influence, but on a mountainside, in the middle of routine, Moses encounters something that refuses to fit neatly into his understanding of the world. A bush burns, yet is not consumed. It is not dramatic in the way empire displays power, but it is unsettling. It resists explanation. It draws attention not through force, but through persistence. Moses turns aside, not because he expects revelation, but because curiosity interrupts habit. What follows is not a speech of reassurance, but a command that destabilizes everything Moses has learned to accept. The God who speaks identifies himself not through abstract attributes, but through relationship and memory. This God claims attentiveness to suffering, awareness of affliction, and intention to act. The cry that rose unnoticed within Egypt has not vanished into silence. It has been received, acknowledged, and answered. This alone marks a radical departure from the logic of empire. A system that survives by normalizing suffering cannot coexist with a God who hears it. Moses, however, does not respond with enthusiasm. His reaction is hesitation, resistance, and doubt. He questions his own adequacy, his authority, and his ability to speak. These objections are not rhetorical. They are the honest responses of someone who understands how deeply Egypt's power is rooted. Moses knows that Pharaoh does not merely rule through force, but through imagination. To confront Egypt is to confront a worldview that has declared itself final. Moses senses, perhaps instinctively, that this calling will not simply oppose a ruler, but disrupt an entire way of understanding reality. The dialogue between Moses and God reveals a crucial dynamic. God does not dismiss Moses' fear, nor does he resolve it by offering guarantees of success. Instead, God insists on presence. The promise is not that the task will be easy or that resistance will dissolve, but that Moses will not act alone. This emphasis shifts the foundation of action away from human capability and toward relational trust. Power is redefined not as control, but as accompaniment. Authority emerges not from status, but from obedience to a call that exceeds personal confidence. When Moses finally returns to Egypt, he does so not as a conqueror, but as a messenger. His words do not threaten immediate destruction. They issue an invitation that sounds almost absurd within the context of empire. Let the people go. This request challenges Pharaoh at the level of imagination before it ever challenges him politically. It suggests that the people do not ultimately belong to the system that depends on their labor. It implies that Egypt's economy, stability, and identity are not absolute. Pharaoh's refusal is therefore predictable. To grant such a request would be to admit that the current order is negotiable. The confrontation that follows escalates gradually, revealing not only Pharaoh's stubbornness, but the fragility of the world he defends. Each sign, each disruption, exposes the limits of control and the vulnerability beneath the appearance of permanence. Egypt's gods, symbols of stability and fertility, prove unable to secure the future they promise. The conflict is not merely about obedience, it is about whose interpretation of reality will prevail. Pharaoh clings to a closed system that cannot imagine change. The God who hears insists that history remains open. Throughout this process, Moses remains an unlikely leader. He does not display unwavering confidence or flawless obedience. He questions, falters, and reacts. Yet it is precisely this humanity that makes him significant. He does not embody the certainty of empire, but the openness of one who has been interrupted. His leadership does not depend on charisma, but on faithfulness to a word that continues to unsettle both him and those he confronts. What begins to shape here is the foundation of an alternative community, though it is not yet fully visible. Before laws are given, before practices are established, before identity is clarified, there is a decisive shift in imagination. The people are invited to see themselves not as permanent fixtures within Egypt's order, but as participants in a story still unfolding. Liberation begins not with movement, but with the collapse of inevitability. Once the present is no longer accepted as final, the future becomes possible. This chapter of the story does not resolve tension, it intensifies it. Egypt resists, Moses hesitates, the people themselves will soon struggle to trust what they cannot yet see. But something irreversible has occurred. A God who hears has spoken. A man who had settled for survival has been called, and the imagination that once belonged entirely to empire has been disrupted.
The wilderness does not announce itself as a place of transformation. It appears empty, indifferent, almost hostile. After the initial urgency of departure fades, the people find themselves surrounded not by promise, but by exposure. The land offers no markers of progress, no visible signs that movement is leading somewhere meaningful. Days stretch under the same sun, nights return with the same cold, and the path forward feels less like a journey and more like endurance. Freedom, once imagined as immediate relief, now feels demanding and uncertain. As time passes, the body begins to speak more loudly than memory. Hunger sharpens attention, thirst narrows perspective, fatigue erodes resolve. These physical realities do not simply test strength, they test trust. In Egypt, suffering had at least been predictable. In the wilderness, uncertainty replaces routine. The people begin to measure freedom not by dignity, but by discomfort. Slowly, almost unconsciously, the imagination turns backward. Egypt, once escaped, is now reconsidered. Its violence is softened in memory, its stability exaggerated. The question emerges again and again, spoken aloud and whispered in frustration. Why did we leave? This question is not rebellion alone. It is fear attempting to reason. The people are not merely nostalgic for food, but for a system that told them what tomorrow would look like. Empire had removed choice, but it had also removed risk. Freedom returns responsibility, and responsibility feels heavier than chains. The wilderness exposes a truth that Egypt had concealed. To be human is to live without guarantees. Provision arrives, but never in a way that satisfies the desire for control. Each morning, food appears just enough for the day, nothing more, nothing to store, nothing to secure tomorrow in advance. Any attempt to accumulate results in decay. This pattern confronts the habits learned under empire, where survival depended on surplus, quotas, and constant anxiety about scarcity. The people are being trained, slowly and unwillingly, to live within limits. Dependence becomes unavoidable. Trust is no longer optional. Day after day, this rhythm repeats: gather, eat, rest, wait. There is no acceleration, no shortcut. Formation happens through repetition, not revelation. The people do not wake one morning suddenly free of fear. They learn over time that the future can be faced one day at a time. This daily provision resists the logic of empire at its core. Egypt taught that security belongs to those who control resources. The wilderness teaches that life is sustained by receiving, not grasping. Time itself undergoes re-education. One day each week, work ceases entirely. This interruption does not arise from abundance, but from command. In the midst of scarcity, rest is required. The people are forced to confront the belief that stopping will lead to collapse. Yet the collapse does not come. The sun rises again. Food appears again. Life continues. The Sabbath quietly dismantles the myth that constant labor is necessary for survival. It teaches the community that worth does not depend on productivity, and that rest is not a luxury, but a declaration of trust. Conflict does not disappear in this new order. Fear resurfaces repeatedly. Complaints return. The people oscillate between gratitude and resentment, obedience and resistance. These struggles are not signs of failure, they are signs of transition. Liberation is not a single moment, but a prolonged unlearning. The wilderness holds the community in this in-between space, where old habits no longer function and new ones are not yet secure. Moses, positioned between the people and the God who called them, feels this tension acutely. His leadership is tested not by opposition from Pharaoh, but by the fragility of those he leads. He cannot compel trust. He cannot manufacture faith. He must endure uncertainty alongside the community, learning that guidance does not mean control. Authority here is exercised through patience rather than force, through presence rather than certainty. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, a different kind of community begins to take shape. It is not defined by monuments or permanence, but by shared dependence. Responsibility circulates rather than accumulates. Vulnerability is no longer hidden, but acknowledged. This way of life remains unstable and incomplete, yet it stands as a living contradiction to Egypt's claims. Without armies, without architecture, without guarantees, the people live as if history has not been closed. The wilderness does not eliminate fear, but it prevents fear from becoming final. It creates space where imagination can breathe again. In this slow formation, the deepest confrontation with empire occurs, not through dramatic overthrow, but through the patient cultivation of a way of life that refuses to accept inevitability.
The story slows as it approaches its end, not because there is nothing left to say, but because resolution would betray its purpose. What has unfolded through Egypt, confrontation, and wilderness was never meant to conclude neatly.
The narrative resists finality in the same way it resists empire. It leaves questions unresolved, tensions intact, and futures undefined. In doing so, it refuses to reduce freedom to a single moment or liberation to a completed event. Egypt, once left behind, does not disappear. It lingers in memory, in habit, in desire. Its logic continues to exert influence long after its physical boundaries have been crossed. The structures that shaped imagination cannot be dismantled overnight. The people carry Egypt with them into the wilderness, not as geography, but as expectation. They continue to measure security by predictability, worth by productivity, and survival by control. This persistence reveals how deeply empire embeds itself, not merely in institutions, but in perception. The alternative community that emerges in response does not confront empire by imitating its strength. It does not build monuments to rival monuments. It does not accumulate resources to compete with accumulation. Instead, it lives differently, slowly, and often imperfectly. Its resistance is not loud, but persistent. Each day of dependence, each refusal to hoard, each interruption of rest stands as a quiet declaration that the present order is not ultimate. In this way, the community becomes a living question posed to every system that claims permanence. Time continues to play a central role in this confrontation. In Egypt, time was a tool of control, structured to maximize production and suppress interruption. In the wilderness, time is reshaped around trust. Days are received rather than seized. Rest is practiced not because it is efficient, but because it is commanded. This reordering of time undermines the anxiety that fuels empire. It teaches the community to inhabit uncertainty without panic, to wait without despair, and to believe that life does not collapse when control is relinquished. The significance of this story does not depend on the moral clarity of its characters. Moses remains hesitant, the people remain fearful, their faith is uneven and fragile. Yet the narrative does not present perfection as the prerequisite for participation in an open future. What matters is not the absence of doubt, but the refusal to accept inevitability. Again and again, the story insists that history remains responsive, that reality is capable of interruption, and that the future has not been sealed. This insistence carries implications beyond its immediate setting. Every age constructs its own Egypts, systems that present themselves as natural, necessary, and final. They promise stability in exchange for imagination, security in exchange for silence. They train people to accept suffering as normal and to regard alternatives as unrealistic. The ancient narrative does not name these systems directly, but it offers a lens through which they can be recognized. Wherever history is declared finished, the story of Moses whispers otherwise. The wilderness, in this sense, is not confined to the past. It appears wherever communities find themselves between what has been left behind and what has not yet been secured. It is uncomfortable, exposed, and uncertain, yet it is also the place where imagination is restored. Here, dependence replaces domination. Here, shared vulnerability becomes the foundation of community.
Here, the future begins to take shape not through force, but through trust. The narrative ends without closure because it seeks not to inform, but to invite. It invites the listener to consider where inevitability has been accepted too easily, where stability has been mistaken for faithfulness, and where imagination has been surrendered in the name of order. It suggests that the work of freedom is primarily not about overthrowing structures, but about cultivating ways of life that quietly undermine them. In this unfinished ending, silence becomes meaningful. The absence of resolution creates space for reflection rather than certainty. The story does not demand agreement, it offers a posture, a way of seeing, a willingness to believe that the world, however solid it may appear, is not immune to change, that suffering, when heard, still matters, and that history, despite every claim to the contrary, remains open.